Welcome. This is DA Sports. I'm your host, DASASIN. Thank you. This is episode 43. Now, in today's episode, we have a couple of things to get into. We, of course, have to touch base on the huge NBA trade that took place within the last week. Then we're going to finish this episode with my NFL awards. So these are basically the AP awards that are going to be announced tomorrow. I'm going to give you my choice for every single award that they have up for grabs. And even though this is not my prediction of who's going to win, it'll be who I think should win each award. So let's get into it. Okay, so for starters, we of course have to touch on this week's huge blockbuster NBA trade that sent Luka Doncic to the Lakers in exchange for Anthony Davis. Yes, there was more to the trade. I believe Utah was also involved in the trade. I believe Max Christie also got involved in the trade. But all of that is just supplemental parts, right? At the end of the day, nobody's going to remember the rest of the assets that came along in order to make the trade happen. Basically, the talking point, the shock value was between Anthony Davis and Luka Doncic. So there's a couple things I want to touch on in regards to the trade. First, of course, is the overall shock value. To me, this is the most shocking trade in NBA history. Maybe even the most shocking trade in all of sports history, considering that it's pretty much considered malpractice to trade one of the best players in the league. I mean, depending on where you rate him, I think everybody would legitimately say Luka's easily a top 10 player in the NBA right now. And most people would argue he's probably a top 5 player in the NBA. Now, if you take into account all of these top players who are also 25 years of age or younger, now the window's even smaller. You know, there may be like 3 players or so that would fall into that range of being a top 10 player, but also 25 or younger in age. So to trade that person who's essentially the face of your franchise, the person who just got your franchise to the NBA Finals last season, it's crazy. It's unheard of. Like, it's absolutely just bonkers. And to be honest, when I first heard about the trade, I thought it was fake. You know, I'm in a couple of sports groups and stuff like that on different social platforms. And when I first saw it posted in one of the platforms, the person who posted it is somebody who often posts things that, you know, other people post that is actually fake, and he just doesn't realize it. So when I first saw who posted it and I saw the post, I'm like, oh, this is just, he got clickbaited again. Like, he reposted something that's just clickbait. So then I looked at the comments and I noticed there were several other people who were commenting on it like as if it was real. And I was like, wait a minute. So then I immediately went to ESPN and then checked, and sure enough, it was the first thing there, and I was just stunned. Like, no way I could imagine that Luka Doncic would ever get traded. And then on the other side, I couldn't imagine that Anthony Davis is going to get traded either, just because Anthony Davis was supposed to be the heir apparent to take over as the Lakers' superstar player. Now, granted, as great as Anthony Davis is as a basketball player, he's not much of a needle mover in terms of popularity. Like, he doesn't do much talking. He doesn't have like a very big personality. He's not polarizing in any way. So the Lakers, if you know anything about Laker history, they have made it a point that their team is going to be driven by showtime. You know, they're going to be driven by big characters who can not only be elite players, but can also sell tickets even if the team sucks. Like, even if you just rewind backwards, obviously they have LeBron right now. Before LeBron, it was Kobe. Before Kobe, it was Shaq. Before Shaq, it was Kareem. Before Shaq, before Shaq, it was Magic. And before Magic, it was Kareem. Before Kareem, it was Jerry West. Like they've basically built their entire franchise on having one of the best players in the league, and that player being, a ticket seller, somebody that everybody wants to flock to, whether they like him or dislike him. Because a lot of people don't even remember back when Magic was in his heyday, there were a lot of people who didn't like Magic. So, but they didn't care because it's about not only just your production on the court, but your ability to sell tickets, to make people want to watch you for one reason or the other. And in that regards, the Lakers hit a home run. They traded off the person who was supposed to be taking over for LeBron but didn't have that star quality for a younger version player who most people would argue is a better player right now, and he's more of a ticket seller. He's more of a person that people will come to the games just to see, especially if you look at like the younger audience from kids' sake. If you go to an elementary school right now and say, hey, do you want to go see Anthony Davis or Luka Doncic, majority of them are going to say Luka, right? So huge win for the Lakers in terms of establishing what they've always established with the franchise, but just crazy that that trade even became available. Now, looking at it specifically from like a stylistic perspective in terms of productivity, it's first starting with this year's impact as it pertains to the Dallas Mavericks. Now, in the short term, as weird as it sounds, I could see Dallas being more productive this year. Now, granted, their biggest obstacle in the West is Oklahoma City, who's the number one seed in the Western Conference. But Dallas happens to be one of the teams that Oklahoma City has struggled with, and Luka generally has had good games against them. I think part of the reason why Dallas was okay with moving Luka is because Dallas has actually been able to beat Oklahoma City this year without Luka. So they realize, like, hey, if we can get a more dynamic big to be paired with Kyrie, who's already an elite ball handler, that could help us more for the present time in terms of making a deep run in the playoffs again. So I think that is possible. Now, I'm not picking Dallas to beat OKC in a 7-game series, but I could see why somebody might, right? And I could see how with AD, if he remains healthy, this could be a great pairing for the short term. Now, in terms of the Lakers from a short-term period, I think they'll have some exciting games. It'll be very interesting to see how Luka and LeBron work with each other. But I think ultimately they don't really fit together in terms of that being the sole part of the driving force of this team in terms of success right now. They definitely are going to need a big. I know they had a huge win the other day against the Clippers, and they were playing small ball and they played good defense, and that's cool, but that's not going to work against the top tier teams. Like, the Clippers aren't bad, but nobody thinks the Clippers are going to win the championship this year. So, as exciting and, of a good look it was for that to happen, I don't think that really translates to the long-term effects of, like, the Lakers having a shot at winning the championship this year, especially against certain teams in the East. Like, if the Lakers today were to play Cleveland in the East with the way they have their bigs, that would be probably a sweep. Cleveland will win 4-0. So immediately, I think it's definitely more of a plus for the Mavericks than it is for the Lakers. Now, in terms of a long-term stretch, I think it's in reverse. So long-term, if you look at the Mavericks, Kyrie, I believe, is like 31, 32. Anthony Davis is around the same age. And then, Klay Thompson is a little bit older also. So long-term, I don't know who they plan to build around, because I would say none of the superstars they have left are people you think like, okay, 5 years from now, they're still going to be around. Or if they are going to be around, they're going to be at the same caliber that they are now. So they're definitely going to have to find somebody to build around in the future, probably in terms of drafting. But because the team is going to be generally good for a while, they're going to be drafting at the end of the rounds and probably not going to be able to get those top tier players that could actually be somebody you build around long term. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to people finding people late in the draft. You look at Nikola Jokic. He was a late draft pick, and obviously he's one of the best players in the league now, but typically that's not how it happens. So it'll be interesting how they transition for the long term, but definitely not super positive long term looking. Now, for the Lakers' perspective, long term, as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's a great fit. Like I said, they got the piece that they want to build around for years to come, and he should be productive for at least another 8 years. So they got what they wanted. They can take a year or two to kind of transition out of everybody used to seeing LeBron take the lead to Luka taking the lead. They do have some other young players still on the team that can help out and still be exciting and help the team win. Obviously, like I mentioned, they're going to have to find a big somewhere. They might find it by tomorrow, which is the trade deadline. But if not, going into the next year or so, that's definitely going to be a hard focus. So, like I said, short term, this benefits Dallas. Long term, this benefits the Lakers greatly. So we'll see how things go out for the rest of the season. Like I said, it'll be interesting to see how each team adjusts to the different playing style. And, the end of the season will really tell us who won the trade as far as it goes for right now. Now, the last thing we're going to get to in this episode is my NFL awards for the season. So a lot of people don't realize, but tomorrow, will be Thursday, is the AP award show. So basically that's where the Associated Press, all their votes have been calculated, and they have a huge ceremony to showcase who won each award. There are 8 categories that will be presented, and I looked at all of the nominees that they have for each award, and I'm going to give you my picks for who should be winning each award. Now, I'll give you who I think should win, and I'll give you a brief reason for why I think they should win. But again, this is not my prediction of who I think they chose or who I think is actually going to walk away with it. This is just, if I had a vote, this is who I would have voted for. This is who I think should win. And then we'll see how it matches up with who they actually picked probably in a week or so. So let's get into it. So the first award I'm going to go over is Offensive Rookie of the Year. Now, this one I feel like is a no-brainer. I also think this is maybe one of the only ones that's going to align with who the AP actually chose. And I think it has to be Jaden Daniels. As much as Brock Bowers was super impressive, he would definitely be second in my voting. But a quarterback is a way harder position than tight end. And especially a quarterback who's taking over a team that only had 4 wins last year. He was a second pick in the draft. There was all this. Nobody really expected Jaden to be what he turned out to be. Now, I know we can't use what happened in the playoffs as part of this awards because the awards are voted for before the playoffs even start. And obviously, if the playoffs were included, that would make it even an easier decision. But even not including the playoffs, I still feel like Jaden's production is the best rookie season we've ever seen. Last year was C.J. Stroud, and we thought, wow, I've never seen a rookie come in, change over a bottom-tier team, and make them this productive. And then Jaden Daniels one-ups him 1 year later. So I think this one's a no-brainer, and I think he'll actually win the award too. Now the next one is Defensive Rookie of the Year. Now to me, my pick for Defensive Rookie of the Year would be Jarrett Verse. Now, interesting enough, if you remember, midway through the season, I put out my leaders for different awards, and Jarrett Verse was my leader at the time for Defensive Rookie of the Year. I'm glad that he actually made it all the way to the end as one of the finalists. Some of the other ones that I had in my top 5 at that time are not in the finalists now. I also think that there was a lot of change from that point to this point, which is why there was so much shift from the 5 that I had projected to be in finalists and the 5 that actually made it. The one mainstay was Jarrett Verse, and I just think that he's going to win it. He was very productive. They had a lot of transition on the Rams where they were trying to, rebuild the defense after not having Aaron Donald. So they seemed to doing that. The beginning of the season started off a little rough, but then they started to pick it up, and the defense really clicked. And I think it was pretty much spearheaded by Jared Verse. So it's a great sign for them as a rookie for him to be so dominant. Now, the next award I'm going to go over is the Offensive Player of the Year. So this one was tough, and most of the final candidates for Offensive Player of the Year were similar to what I had as my Offensive Player of the Year candidates when I mentioned them mid-season. I went back and forth with this one, but I'm actually going to pick Saquon Barkley as my Offensive Player of the Year. Main reason why is he did run for 2,000 yards, and he didn't play in the last game of the season. And I do think that if he played the last game of the season, he would have broken the rushing record. You also think about some of the games where they sat him at the end of games where he could have got more yardage. I think he would have been even more motivated with the last game of the season being against the Giants, against his old team, with everybody watching. Like, it would have been so perfect. I really wish they would have went for it, but the reason they didn't is because they said, hey, it's more important to focus on the Super Bowl. And guess what? They made it to the Super Bowl, so it so far looks like it was the right decision. We'll see how it turns out on Sunday, but nonetheless, I think that his impact has greatly improved his team. Even when the passing game wasn't what people were expecting, Saquon was still carrying this team to being productive offensively. And to be able to carry a team like this with so many weapons from the running back position is just amazing. Obviously, a part of that has to do with the offensive line, which is regarded as probably the best offensive line in the league, so that helps. But nonetheless, some of the plays that Saquon has made were because of Saquon. It was just him doing ridiculous moves, juking people, having great vision, all of that. So I do think that I'm going to go with Saquon as the Offensive Player of the Year. Now, for Defensive Player of the Year, this one was really, really tight. I could see a reason for every single person making it. My vote is actually going to go to Pat Surtain II. Now, the reason why I picked Surtain over some of the defensive ends like Myles Garrett, TJ Watt, Trey Hendrickson, mainly because of impact. If you look at what was expected of these teams and where they ended up, I think Denver being able to make the playoffs was much more of a surprise versus what was expected of them before the season started than where they finished. I think a lot of these other teams that, either missed the playoffs like Cleveland and Cincinnati were expected to either make the playoffs or be really close to the playoffs. And then in terms of Pittsburgh, they were able to make the playoffs, which I did predict, but some people didn't. But even the people that didn't still expected them to be close to it. So their range of production versus what they were expected to do was a lot smaller than what it is with Denver. And I felt like Denver definitely exceeded everyone's expectations, and a big part of that was their defense, especially considering that they started a rookie quarterback, and it took him a while to kind of really learn the ropes. Like, he definitely got it kicked up towards the second half of the season, but the reason why they were even in games and still having a good record is because their defense was playing really well, and their defense was led by Pat Surtain, so I'm giving him the nod for Defensive Player of the Year. Okay, so the next award is for Comeback Player of the Year. Now, for clarity, they made a huge distinction this year that Comeback Player of the Year is not somebody coming back from being terrible the previous year. For most of the years, the general idea for Comeback Player of the Year was, okay, you sucked last year, and then now you're good this year. But they wanted to distinguish because there was all this uproar over Joe Flacco winning over DeMar Hamlin last year when DeMar Hamlin died, and Joe Flacco just went from being on his couch to being a starter at the end of the season. So they wanted to kind of differentiate and make sure it was clear that Comeback Player of the Year is supposed to be somebody coming back from an injury. Now, it looks like from the voters, not everybody got the memo because, for example, Sam Darnold is on this list when Sam Darnold wasn't injured last year. He was just a backup. If you were going by the old rules of Comeback Player of the Year, I would definitely think that Sam Darnold would win because nobody really expected him to look as productive as he did throughout the season. but that's not how the rule is written. It's got to be somebody who was injured. So in that regards, for comeback player of the year, I'm going with Joe Burrow. People forget that he did get injured. He was injured before the start of the season. Then he played and then got injured midway through the season and missed the rest of this year. And even though he was playing okay at that time, he wasn't playing to the top tier level that people expect him to. And this year, even though his team wasn't able to make it to the playoffs, his numbers were pretty extraordinary. I believe he led the league in passing yards and passing touchdowns. And even though he had more interceptions than like Lamar and Josh Allen, his interceptions weren't like astronomical kind of thing. So I think based on the fact that he was even being considered for MVP of the year after coming off a year where he was injured, you got to go with Joe Burrow as the comeback player of the year based on the new rules. So the next one is assistant coach of the year. Now for assistant coach of the year, I had to go with Brian Flores. Now Brian Flores is a huge reason why Minnesota was fighting for the number 1 seed going into the playoffs. Going into that last week of the season, had they beat Detroit, they would have been the number 1 seed in the NFC. And nobody before the season would have imagined that Minnesota had any chance of being the number 1 seed in the NFC. And a huge part of that was because of their defense, and a huge reason why their defense was like that is because of Brian Flores. He's always been good defensively. I think even when he was a head coach, the defense was much improved than they were before he got there. So his defensive mind has been on display, and it really played a big role in Minnesota's success this year. So I think ultimately he deserves the assistant coach of the year. Now for coach of the year, this one was tough. I kind of went back and forth with a few. Like, I was really leaning towards giving it to Andy Reid because essentially he went 15-1, and they dealt with so many different injuries that people just kind of like glossed over because they're like, oh, you have Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, so them winning a lot is not a big deal. But to me, I think it was a big deal. They lost their starting running back. They lost who was supposed to be the number 1 receiver in the offseason. They lost him before the season and didn't have him until the very end of the season. Then they lost their previous number 1 receiver early into the season. Then they lost linemen. They had to shuffle linemen. They lost their number 2 corner. So dealing with all of these injuries and still having the team prepared every single week was the reason why I was leaning Andy, but I ended up saying that I'm picking him second, and instead I'm going with Dan Quinn as the coach of the year. Kind of back to what I mentioned earlier, it's really about expectations. I think people seeing the Chiefs lose one game during the season, yes, it may not have been expected with all the injuries, but before the season, if you didn't know the injuries were coming, you'd be like, and somebody said, hey, the Chiefs will win 15 games this year, you'd be like, okay, yeah, I can see that. But on the flip side, if somebody said, the Commanders are going to win 11 games this season, people would be like, what? No, there's no way, right? So I think that's why I'm giving it to Dan Quinn. He's his first year back as a head coach after coming off of being blamed for the loss as a defensive coordinator on his last team in the playoffs last year. He has a rookie quarterback. He's got a offensive coordinator who had been scrutinized a lot for the last time he was a head coach. And, they just had new ownership. There's all this change. So for him to be able to come in, have all this change, and get his team to the production level that he did, got to give it up and give it to Dan Quinn for the coach of the year. Now for the final award, the one that's been the most talked about all year, the one that's probably the closest in terms of what I think to expect from the voting, is the MVP award. Now for MVP, I've said it all year, I got to give it to Josh Allen. I think it goes back to expectations. I know a lot of people talked about Lamar Jackson, but if you told me before the season that Baltimore was going to win 11 games and be the 3 seed going into the playoffs in the AFC, I'd be like, ooh, they weren't as productive as I thought they would be. right? Whereas Buffalo, I think they ended up winning 13 games, 13 or 14. If you told me Buffalo was going to win 13 or 14 games and go in as a 2 seed, I'd be like, whoa. Considering everything they lost before the season started, from both of their starting receivers to most of their defensive backfield, yeah, I would say that would be way more shocking. And the only reason it happened is because of Josh Allen. Whereas on the flip side with Baltimore, a lot of Lamar Jackson's success was based off of Derrick Henry. I talked about it all throughout the season. Their win-loss record was directly correlated to the number of carries that Derrick Henry got, and that even showed itself again in the playoffs. So, with that being said, I think the most valuable player has to be Josh Allen. I think if you take Josh Allen off of the Bills this year, the Bills don't even come close to making the playoffs. If you take Lamar Jackson off of the Ravens this year, I think they still make the playoffs. I think they fall some. They may not win their division, but I think they still make the playoffs. So, yeah, ultimately, I think that Josh Allen had to do more, had to overcome more, and his team was more productive. So, I'm giving the MVP to Josh Allen. So that's it for this week's episode. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Please make sure you like and subscribe and share wherever possible. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Peace.